Welcome to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio, bringing you insights and strategies to help you create a magnificent and fulfilling second half of life. Here's your host, certified professional retirement coach and best-selling author, Dr. Dorian Mintzer.
I want to welcome everybody to my fourth Tuesday Revolutionize Your Retirement Interview with Expert series. I'm Dorian Mintzer, owner of Revolutionize Retirement and your host for this program. I just want to now start and introduce you to our guest, Connie Zweig, and I'm just so delighted that Connie is with us today. Connie Zweig has a PhD. She's a retired therapist, co-author of Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow, author of Meeting the Shadow of Spirituality, and has written also a novel, A Moth to the Flame, which is the life of a Sufi poet Rumi. Her newest book, The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, extends shadow work into later life and teaches aging as a spiritual practice. Connie's been doing contemplative practices for 50 years. She's a wife and grandmother and was initiated as an elder by Saging International in 2017. After investing in all these roles, she's practicing the shift herself from role to soul. I just want to comment, I've read Connie's book, which I think is wonderful, and I've heard her speak now once with Ashton Applewhite, which was really a lovely, lovely experience. Many of you on the call have heard Ashton because she was my guest a few years ago. And I'm just delighted that Connie's here with us today. And it was a number of years ago, I can't even remember what year, they all blend together now, but at a positive aging conference, I did a little workshop that Connie led so that I was able to really focus firsthand on having pictures and really being able to get in touch with some of my shadow in terms of aging. So anyway, Connie, welcome. And I know you've had such a successful career, teaching, writing about the shadow, being a therapist. I think it might be good if we start with like a definition, because I'm not sure if everybody on the call really understands what you mean by shadow. And so maybe tell us about that and how you got interested in this topic.
Dory, that's a good place to start, but let me first say I'm so thrilled to be here. I've listened to some of your interviews. I think we did meet in Philadelphia, and I'm just
That's where it was, Philadelphia.
Yeah, and I'm honored to have this opportunity with you, really excited about it. So shadow is a term that was coined by Carl Jung to refer to the personal unconscious. And I got interested in the topic a long time ago. I think it was in my 30s or 40s, and ended up creating Meeting the Shadow, which is an anthology of expert thinkers about how the unconscious intervenes in our conscious lives. So here's how the shadow is formed. As we're growing up, we want to get love and approval from adults. And the adults give us messages, sometimes loud and sometimes really quiet, about what's okay and what's not okay, what's permitted and what's forbidden. So if you grow up in a family where anger is forbidden or even punished, your feelings of anger go into the shadow. That means they get repressed, they get buried into some part of the body-mind that holds that energy there so that it's not expressed. If your family forbids or in some way makes taboo another feeling like sadness. One client told me she wasn't allowed to be sad or her father would feel like a failure. So all that sorrow and depression was banished into her shadow, and for her that erupted in midlife. So what doesn't get expressed in our lives gets repressed. That's kind of a simple way of saying it. What doesn't get lived out gets buried in the shadow. And the poet Robert Bly used to describe the shadow as a long bag that we drag behind us. It's carrying all of our stuff. And it erupts spontaneously at different moments in our lives. So we might meet some content from the shadow when it erupts in a sarcastic remark that we make, like, oh, he's so lazy. And we didn't mean to say that. We didn't want to be mean, but our shadow is erupting with a judgment or a projection. We also meet it in projections when we attribute to other people what we don't accept in ourselves, what is in our shadow. So I used to have a client who really didn't accept her sexuality, and she would see other women as too seductive. And so she was seeing a shadow outside of herself in a projection. So, I had this career of seeing patients who came to me from my books. Romancing the Shadow developed a methodology for working with these issues and learning how to make a more conscious relationship with your unconscious. Because a lot of times the material comes out in relationships and sabotages people's intimacy. Like if you continually choose the wrong person in a relationship, it has to do with your shadow. If you criticize your partner, it has to do with your shadow. If you sabotage your intimacy, it has to do with your shadow. So romancing the shadow was about all of that. And I saw people for 30 years and helped them to orient to their unconscious and begin to work with this material. And then in my late 60s, I noticed that I was thinking about retirement and I started to feel disoriented. And I was kind of surprised that I was feeling that way because, I've been doing my inner work and meditating for so long. And I realized that I was starting to ask myself, who am I if I'm not Dr. Connie, the shadow expert, the writer, the therapist? Who am I? And I found the training with Saging International, the year-long training to become an elder. And I took that training and I realized that everybody there was experiencing a late life identity crisis. That's what I came to call it. It hasn't really been identified in developmental psychology. Some people experience it in their 50s or 60s or 70s or even 80s. But there's another moment when we begin to ask, who am I? If I'm not my roles and my old identities and personas, who am I? And when I took that training, it was really wonderful, but it also didn't have anything about the unconscious, the shadow. No material on that, and I couldn't find any books on that. And so I said to my husband, oh my God, I think I have to write another book. So that's what the new book, The Inner Work of Age, is about. It's about meeting the shadows of age and how we can break free of them.
Oh, it's fascinating to hear the story, and just to comment to people that throughout the book, and I really recommend that you get it and read it, Connie shares a lot about her own journey and aspects of herself, too, as well as stories of other people. So tell us more, if you would, about some of the shadows as we get older, because I think it is so important. And I know, you talk about some of the shadows that you identify in some respects as our inner ageist. So maybe this is an opportunity to really tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. As you said, I do disclose a lot about my own journey in the book. And I think that's because as an elder now, I really feel a freedom not to hide anymore. I'm not protecting anything, and my ego is not so engaged anymore. So it felt much freer to tell my own experiences of doing the inner work of age. So the first shadow figure that I discovered in myself was when I was sitting in my favorite vegan restaurant, and this woman sat down next to me, and she was quite old, and she was clearly poor. She had on kind of raggedy clothes, and her body was dirty. Her nails and her hair were dirty. And I noticed that I said to myself, she doesn't belong here. She's so old. I'm not going to be like that when I'm old, and I'm not going to be poor. And I feel kind of sorry for her, but she was ordering free samples of food, and I was saying these things to myself that were really judgmental. And because I've been doing shadow work for so long, I was attuned to my own inner dialogue. And I realized that it was ageist. And Dory, I was horrified at myself. I was ashamed. And I have been fighting sexism and racism and homophobia and all the isms all my life as a political activist. And here I was ageist inside. And so that was a rude awakening, and I formed it. I used my method, and I turned it into a shadow character, which I called the inner ageist. And as I began to do the research for my book, I discovered that this internal figure is epidemic in our culture. There's been research that shows that many, many women in our culture have an internal figure that's like a bag lady who is old and poor and homeless, and that the fear of losing our financial security, the fear of being dependent and alone, is this shadow figure that looks like a bag lady, but it's on the inside in the shadow. And so I wrote about that and had a lot of response to it. And that was kind of the first figure that I identified. And what I realized was, as I identified more and more shadows of age, each one of them was in denial about something. So the inner ageist is in denial of the value of age. It worships youth like the larger culture does. It says young is good and old is bad. Well, if old is bad as I'm growing old, then I'm rejecting myself. Then I'm feeling shame about myself, whether it's my body or my slowness or my dependency or whatever it is, my appearance or my end of work, my retirement. If I'm feeling badly about that, then I'm not self-accepting, and I can't really be self-actualizing if I don't have a basis of self-acceptance. So this has a lot of implications. And then I actually found research out of Yale University about the inner ageist. It's not called that, but it's about negative images of age in the unconscious. And this researcher found that those beliefs and attitudes and images affect our physiology. They affect our heart rate, our memory, our cognitive health, our mental health, and even our longevity. So that just blew my mind, that this unconscious shadow figure is having an impact on the body-mind throughout the lifespan and as we age. So that's kind of the first shadow figure that I work with. And then the book is built around about a dozen of them, and then the developmental tasks that we need to do to break free of each one.
Can you talk more about that? Because, I mean, it sounds like in your practice you have developed, some practices really and ways of confronting these these shadow figures, but the inner ageist, the person who's fearful and frightened about old people and growing older, so frightened about our future self. What are some ways of confronting it and dealing with it?
Well, let's talk about retirement, because that's the theme of your podcast. So, right. As we move toward retirement is like a Rorschach test. We project onto it all those fears that you were just naming. Maybe retirement means that I'm old and that's terrible. Maybe retirement means that I'm going to become useless and invisible. Maybe retirement means that I'll have nothing to do and I'll be bored. Or maybe it means that I'll get sick, or at a deeper level, maybe it means that I'll die soon after. And that fear of mortality is underneath the fear of retirement, in the shadow, for many, many people. So there are a lot of unconscious fears and beliefs that we project onto retirement, and then there are also positive ones, right? I'm going to be free of all the responsibilities. I'm going to have leisure time to do just what I want to do, or be with the grandkids, or volunteer. And that, too, is a projection on retirement, because we don't really know how it's going to unfold. We don't really know what it's going to be like until we're in it, moment to moment. So there's no guidance in our culture for emotional and spiritual retirement planning. And I think that one of the great contributions that you're making with this podcast is that there are so many people offering guidance about this transition that they can't get from their families or their financial advisors or their grandparents or anybody else. So it's really a great contribution. So my little contribution to this is to orient to the unconscious, to orient to the shadow, and see what's hiding there about this transition to retirement. So in the book, I tell a story about a client. His name was George. And when he was initially working in his 30s, his grandfather retired and spent the rest of his life watching TV in a rocking chair. And so George internalized that image of retirement. He didn't know that. He didn't think, oh, that's what Grandpa's modeling for me about retirement, of course. But that's what he internalized. And then when George's father retired, he just played bridge all day and didn't do anything else. Nothing creative, nothing. That was what he did. And so George internalized that image. So when he came to see me in his late 60s, he was really burned out from his business. He knew, a part of him knew he should retire. It was a should. And another part of him resisted and couldn't even imagine giving up work. So there are many ways to explore this. But as we kind of excavated his shadow, we began to see, underneath the financial fears and underneath the what will I do with the time fears, we began to see that he had this shadow of the useless retiree, that's what he called it, that was modeled by his grandfather and his father that he watched throughout his lifespan. And so unconsciously he believed if he stopped working, he would be useless. He said to me, if I'm not a provider, who am I? And this is so true for many people now. It used to be only men, but now women as well. If I'm not a provider, who am I? That basic spiritual question arises. So for George, he began to see that the useless retiree shadow figure was sabotaging him. It was stopping him from making a transition that he needed to make for his own well-being. And he began to teach his grandchildren to read, and he felt useful doing that. And then, just kind of on a whim, he signed up for a watercolor class, and he found himself just loving it and wanting to spend more and more time painting. And so slowly, he went part-time, and then eventually he released his business to the vice president, and he was able to retire. And he said to me, I've never felt so happy. I'm so carefree when I'm painting, and I have time for my grandkids. and he was really grateful. So for our listeners, you can get a sense that I'm extending my work on the shadow with unconscious feelings, beliefs, attitudes, and images, and how they affect our transitions in later life. That's what it's about.
And George is such a beautiful example, and you have others in the book. I know many people on the call, or some people on the call, are people going through transitions themselves. Others are coaches or therapists. So I think it's so interesting and helpful to think about how this relates both to yourself as well as to the work you do. I know part of what I love in my work is I both am trained as a therapist as well as a coach. And I do think understanding kind of the unconscious and how that works for us and these shadow figures is so important because it can be part of that transition to the new beginning. You have a nice way of talking about the transition kind of time in your book. Can you share that with people?
You mean the Rite of Passage model?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Yep.
Well, I think there are several transitions after midlife that we go through. Retirement is a big one, but there are others as well. Serious illness is a big transition when we lose our roles and identities. Becoming an elder is a really positive transition when we also shift our identity. Becoming a grandparent is a big transition. Loss of important people is a big transition. And the sort of experts in life transitions have found that there are 3 steps to make a transition into a rite of passage. And the first step is letting go. So if we look at retirement in this context, we might be letting go of what we do. Then we're letting go of our schedule, our workplace, our work families and teams. Then we're letting go of our deeper identification with what we do. I call this shadow the doer. I'm a CEO, that's who I am. Or I'm a teacher, or I'm a mom, or I'm a therapist, that's who I am. And so letting go involves releasing the doer, which is a very deep identity in our culture, because most people are either consciously or unconsciously identified with what they do. You go to a party and people introduce themselves with what they do, and their success, and their achievement, and their productivity. So it's not a simple thing, this first step of letting go, and letting go of the doer. And then the next step is being in liminality or uncertainty, the between time. It's like the chrysalis. It's like the caterpillar is no longer a caterpillar. It's in the chrysalis, and it's not yet a butterfly. So we're in the chrysalis stage, and that uncertainty can be scary. It feels formless. It feels like there's no net underneath us. Now, my client George didn't do it that way. He began with teaching his grandkids and taking up painting before he completely let go. So that's a different way to do it. But some people are forced into retirement by ageism. And so if that happens, they don't have a choice, right? They go right into the uncertainty stage. And then the third step is emerging renewed, emerging into a new archetype, in our case, the elder, emerging into a new life pattern, a new blueprint. In my language, it's a new archetype. So how does that happen? It happens because this rite of passage, when we undergo all these stages of the transition, we are changed. We're transformed, and we emerge into another stage of life. And so that's kind of the context for the inner work of age. And as I've been teaching therapists, I just taught the LA County Psychological Association, and I just taught LA California Marriage and Family Therapists. And what people have said to me is, as they're using the book with their clients, they're recognizing that the book itself is a rite of passage to become an elder. And that has been the most wonderful feedback for me that I could have gotten, because that's really what I wanted. I really wanted therapists to be able to use it with their clients, and so that's just beginning to happen.
That's exciting to hear. And I think coaches can also find it really helpful.
Yes.
I know that there are a number of people who are going through coach training who don't have the therapy background, but in fact at the end I'll give a code for those people in the program that I'm somewhat involved with, that I'm involved with too. But
that's
I think
great.
I think that it is such an important process, and to think about how we emerge from it. And I do have a question here from Dale from Arizona, who he wants you to just expand a little more, if you would, on what is an elder. How do you define an elder?
Okay, great. So for me, an elder is a stage, not an age. You know, an 80-year-old person, let's say a man, an 80-year-old man, could be rigid in his thinking, feel bitter, feel regret about his life. He's not an elder for me. A 55-year-old man could be very self-aware and very psychologically connected to his issues and want to be in service to the common good and doing some kind of a spiritual practice, let's say prayer or meditation or some kind of practice. And so that person could be called an elder, because that's a different stage than the person who is bitter and closed down, who might be chronologically older. So I spend a lot of time in the book kind of exploring what is an elder, because I think that is a missing piece in our culture. You know, it's in indigenous, native cultures here, but it's not in the general white kind of postmodern, post-industrial culture because of the ageism, because we have so much institutional ageism in our healthcare and in our education and so forth. So the need, the rite of passage to become an elder is a missing piece. I think some people can do that in therapy, especially if they go through a life review. I think a life review is an essential tool to become an elder, and I teach you how to do that in the book. The traditional life review is kind of looking at the key people and events in your life and seeing how they unfolded and possibly reframing them, and looking for places where you might need repair, where you want to give and receive forgiveness, which is part of becoming an elder. And then I added the shadow dimension to the life review. And how do we look at our unlived life in the shadow and what was repressed, as I mentioned earlier, and how that has unfolded. And then, what do we want to reclaim now from the shadow? What do we want to live now that was unlived earlier in our lives? And that's part of becoming an elder. So for my client George, it was about his creativity. And, you know, we're finding that there was ageism built into the whole framework of creativity. I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, I was told, if you haven't written your masterpiece by 30, forget about it. And the same thing with painting or composing music, you know. It all had to be done by your 30s. And we're finding this is a total myth. It's been debunked. And a lot of artwork and music was created by people in their 70s and 80s and 90s. So I write about that with such joy in the book, because this is another opportunity for people. As we become elders, we can express ourselves creatively in ways that we never have before. So there are a lot of different components to becoming an elder. I would say, emotional, creative, intellectual, spiritual development, shadow awareness. And then, Dori, one thing is, one of the shadow issues is denial of death, denial of mortality. And I think that if we deny our mortality, we can't really become an elder, because we're not aware of the limited time horizon in which we live. And that is not penetrating us, and so we're not fully present here now, taking advantage of the time we have if we're not aware of our mortality.
I so agree. Can you expand on that? I mean, what would be ways, and what are ways that you've learned from your own life experiences, work, as well as what you talk about in the book of ways to face that and deal with the fears and the shadow in relation to that, to our mortality, so we can live more fully?
Yeah, it's such a profound question. And I think it has shifted some with COVID, because we all saw during the pandemic a lot of death around us. And some of us experienced losses from COVID. And so that has awakened people to, the reality of mortality. And whatever we believe about life after death, I'm not really posing metaphysical questions, but I am saying this body will die. My Connie-ness will pass. And as I hold that truth kind of in my peripheral vision, it has penetrated more and more. And it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I asked myself this question: what is the only gift that I can give in the time remaining? And I think that's a good question for all of us and for our clients. What is the only gift that you can give? And I knew that there was no material about the shadow and age, and so I felt compelled to do that. And also the other question I asked myself was, what will I regret not doing on my deathbed? Or what will I regret not saying on my deathbed? And that's also a really key question for us and for our clients, that brings people into an awareness of the urgency of the time that we have left. My friend Phil told me that he's 73 now, and he's always wanted to write a novel, but he spent his career writing nonfiction to pay the bills. And he said, if I don't write that novel, I'm going to have that regret when I'm dying. And so he's doing it now. And I think that's a good question for all of us. And it's also related to retirement, Dori, because if we continue to do what we've always done, working at the same job, at the same pace, and we don't slow down to self-reflect, then we don't have the space to ask ourselves these questions. We don't have the space internally to really explore emotional life repair or spiritual life repair or going through this rite of passage, because we're going to work until we drop. And so without the time for the self-reflection, all of the stuff I'm talking about doesn't happen.
Well, it's so true, and it can be such a conflict at times. I mean, I know for myself, I so love my work and love helping people deal with just these kind of issues you're talking about, and yet it's true, there can be a denial of opening the space for myself to do other things. It's a constant struggle. So it leads to this next kind of part of a question, which is, how do you know if you're denying kind of the internal call, perhaps, to retire?
Okay, great question. Is that from you, that question?
A combination of for me and actually one of the bullet points you had on your talk today.
Okay, great. I just wondered if it was from a caller. Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't from a caller, but yeah.
So this is subtle. This is subtle, and this is about attunement and listening to ourselves and our inner dialogue, and making it a practice to do self-observation and attune to our inner dialogue, because there's so much information there, and most of the time we dismiss it. We're too busy, so we dismiss it, right? So if you sit quietly, if you meditate, great, because then you can do a centering practice and you can listen to your mind, and you know you can observe it, and you're not your mind, you're not your thoughts. If you don't have a practice to observe your mind, just sit quietly for a few minutes, take a few deep breaths, and say to yourself, retirement. And ask and watch what comes up. Just watch what comes up. What feelings come up? What bodily sensations come up? Do you say to yourself, I want more time alone. I want less time alone. I want to slow down, but I'm afraid of feeling useless. I want to quit my job, but I want to do something else. I don't know what it is. I don't want to quit my job. I really like it. But I don't have time for my grandkids, and they're growing up so quickly. So when you begin to attune to this internal dialogue and the feelings that come up with it, notice the joy, notice the sorrow, notice the fear, the feelings that come up. And then notice what repeats itself. What are the repeating patterns from day to day? So what's sticking around and not just fleeting? And then ask yourself, is that voice my shadow, or is that voice my higher self? My soul whispering? My spirit? Is that the voice of my intuition or my spirit? Or is that the voice of my shadow, sabotaging me? And as you begin to sort those or discriminate between those voices, you'll eventually learn who to follow and who is sabotaging you. And if you can detect the voice of your soul or your higher self, and that it's actually leading you, I call that my holy longing. My longing is leading me somewhere. It's led me all my life. It's guided me. It's been an internal guide. And then to be able to discriminate that from the voice of a shadow character, then you know whether to heed the call or deny the call. It may not be your time to retire from paid work. I mean, my husband keeps telling me he's not ready. He loves being a psychologist and seeing patients, and he's not ready. And yet he has a serious illness. And so we're just kind of working together on what's going to be the right timing for him to stop working. Some of it is financial, some of it is emotional, some of it is spiritual, and some of it is a health issue and fatigue. Mm-hmm. And all of these things come into account with the decision of retirement, and also your relationship, because retirement affects our marriages and our change in roles. If one of us retires and the other one doesn't, the relationship changes, right? So I've been using this phrase, role to soul, and I don't want to miss out on talking about that. Role to soul is a phrase that I borrowed from the spiritual teacher Ram Dass. And I remembered hearing it decades ago, and it just stayed with me. And when I was writing the book, I thought, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. And so the decision to retire also has to do with an inner call to shift from the doer or the role identity to a deeper spiritual identity, who we really are, whether we call it soul or spirit or essence or higher self, who we really are. Because those roles are fleeting. They're going to fall away. You know, I am a therapist or coach. That's going to fall away. Even I am a writer is going to fall away. I am a wife is going to fall away. But I am a soul is not going to fall away. Or I am spirit. Or I am that which breathes through everything. That's not going to fall away. And so part of the deep work of retirement, and I call it retirement as spiritual practice, is to make this internal shift in identity from our doing to our being, right? From role to soul. And as we do that, we might still be working as we do the practices in the book that turn your attention in this way from role to soul. We can do the practices while we're still working. And then we can do it in the transition. And then we can do the practices after we're working. And we can expand our spiritual practice to include this embodiment of a deeper identity. And that's retirement as a spiritual practice.
Wonderful. Can you expand on that? Just sort of about what are some of the spiritual practices and how and in what ways do they seem to change, or have you discovered that they change, or do they as we age? I think that would be really helpful if you can elaborate on that.
You know, I interviewed a whole bunch of spiritual teachers in the book. So there are interviews with Krishna Das, and he talks about his practice has not changed. He's a devotional yoga person who does chanting, and that's what he does. I interviewed Ken Wilber, who's a great spiritual philosopher and teaches integral practice. His practices have changed with aging. He has serious illness, and his practices have changed. Mirabai Bush, who wrote the last book with Ram Dass, her practices have also changed. She's doing, after a lifetime of doing Hindu and Buddhist meditation practices, she's doing yoga for flexibility, and she's doing Aikido for concentration. Rabbi Rami Shapiro, who's a Jewish mystic and also Vedanta practitioner, he has, oh God, it was amazing what he told me that he does every day. He has 5 practices that he does every day, and they each have a different purpose in his aging consciously. So, you know, I also interviewed Father Thomas Keating, who brought centering prayer to the world and lived as a monk in his later life. And he gave me what I would call a spiritual life review. He told the story of his life in the context of his spiritual development. It was really beautiful, Dory. And then he died a few months later. He was 95 at the interview. And then he died, and I just was so moved that he had given me that time to talk about his spiritual life. So, yes, spiritual practices change as we age. If someone has a practice that is working for them, it doesn't have to change. Physical limitations may come up. You know, you may no longer be able to sit cross-legged for an hour like you used to. And so things will change. Or you may not be able to do yoga asanas or walking meditation the way that you used to, and so things will change. So I have a lot of practices in the book for people who are at different stages of practice, people who are beginners. You know, there are practices to learn concentration, to learn how to quiet your mind, people who are more advanced. There are practices, you know, for different purposes. And then I created some practices for the shift from role to soul, which are about breaking our identification with the doer. So we sit and we become centered and we say to ourselves, I am not the doer, or whatever name we give to that shadow character. I am not the provider. And we practice really feeling and embodying that and breaking our identification with the doer. And then we shift into I am, and we give it your name for your spiritual identity. I am spirit. I am soul. I am the self. And we practice breaking the identification and then becoming, internalizing the deeper spiritual identity and sitting with that practice every day until we can begin to really feel it in the body, mind, and carry it into our lives. And then we may slip up, and identify with what we're doing. And then we remember again who we really are. And that's the practice.
Great. What if some people don't feel that there's that spiritual component? What are some ways people... Yeah, okay.
That's a really good question because, my book is not about beliefs. Mm-hmm. It doesn't tell anybody what to believe, and it's because of my own experiences in meditation, I know that I am not my beliefs. I'm not my mind. So it's not about beliefs. They're not required to do the inner work of age. And some people are agnostic, or they're scientists and they don't believe in anything other than the material world. And that's okay. That's where they are. So then we might practice, I am not the doer, I am, and fill in what it is that fits, that resonates for you. I am a seed that will recycle into becoming a tree. Or I am a drop that will fall into the ocean and become a cloud. Or whatever it is that fits for you. Because this is not, there are no shoulds here. I think part of becoming an elder is letting go of the shoulds.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is really for anyone, independent of beliefs. You can create practices that expand your identity in a way that works for you.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really important. And I think also, I just want to underscore what you said before too, that, the shifting from role to soul, one can start allowing oneself to get more in touch with that inner world even while you're still working, which then can help you down the road. It's not, you stop working and then you, make the shift. So I just wanted to sort of underscore that. I know you sort of said it and it's in the book.
Let's clarify. Yes, let's clarify that. So here's the reason that's possible. It's not about what we do or don't do. Work more, work less, volunteer more, volunteer less. It's about the state of mind in which we do what we do. The quality of awareness in which we do what we do. So some people cannot financially afford to stop working, and this is actually true of millions of baby boomers, unfortunately, sadly. So we can't stop working. What I'm suggesting is we can do the inner work of age and bring a different quality of awareness to our work. And then we can feel differently about it. We can feel less trapped. We can feel less obligated because we're working on our internal awareness, the stage of our awareness that we bring to the workplace. And that can be liberating in itself.
I think that's such an important point, and there are a number of questions in terms of the role of money and income, and I think you're speaking to that right now. And it also made me think. I often talk about kind of person role. When you think about work, that we bring who we are to the role that we're in, and I think that the consciousness of that and thinking about who we are throughout our work as well as who we are without being the doer is so important. And I wonder if maybe you could comment on that a bit.
Yeah. There are as many elders as there are people. There are as many, Joseph Campbell talked about the hero with the 1,000 faces, right? So there were as many heroes in midlife as there are heroic people. And there are as many elders as there are elders in this stage of life. So when we're working, there are as many CEOs or therapists or lawyers or doctors or secretaries or salespeople as there are individuals. Each of us is going to do that job differently. Each of us is going to flesh out the role and embody the role with our unique individual differences. Just like in the movies, if Meryl Streep plays a role versus, Helen Mirren plays the role or Julianne Moore plays the role, it's going to be different, right? So what I'm suggesting is that those roles have become an essential part of us at work. And that's okay. That's what that stage of life is about for us. I call it empire building, It's about building a foundation for our families. It's about contributing to the world. In developmental psychology, we would say it's about building an ego, which we need to be able to operate in the world. But after midlife, as we go into our late 50s, 60s, or 70s, the meaning and purpose of life changes. It's no longer about building an ego or being heroic. It's no longer about the ego's agenda, and this is back to the question about becoming an elder. It's no longer about the ego's agenda. It's about beginning to let go, little by little, of the ego's control, and therefore of the role's identity with our lives, the role's control of our lives. And discovering, something larger, discovering a connection to something beyond ego, to something larger than ourselves. So for people who are not spiritual, that something larger can be the environment, can be Gaia, can be all living humans, animals, and plants, right? There's more and more conversation now with the climate crisis about how everything is connected and we're all in the same boat. So our connection to that is essential later in life. And there are actually many elders in Elders Action Network working on the climate crisis together. Or this new organization that Jane Fonda and Bill McKibben just launched. It's called The Third Act. It's for elders working on the climate crisis. It's fantastic. So, letting go of our roles doesn't mean that we stop doing or contributing. But it does mean that our identity can open and expand to something larger.
That's a beautiful way of saying it. And I'm so delighted that Connie's able to stay with us a little longer. And I want to integrate more of the questions and comments, if that's okay with you now, Connie?
That sounds great.
Okay. And there's some you've already responded to, so I'm not going to ask them because you have talked some about the money and income. And I think, your recent talking about the opening, that one can still think of oneself in a role and the role of the giving back and the active. And I know there's a section in the book where you talk about your discovery of the importance of that where you were more entrenched in the practices, but realizing, there's also needs to be that action of giving back, oversimplifying it. But there was a beautiful section where you were talking about sort of for yourself, some of the integration of these different kind of parts of yourself. Lourdes from the UK says, these examples and shadow images resonate with me. I've been looking for role models of aging. A 90-year-old friend once said, more has been given to me than has been taken away by aging. You're now showing us a way to get to that kind of enlightenment. So I want to read both comments as well as some questions. And Meg from Cambridge says, another quality of elder, according to Rabbi Salman Schechter Shalomi, is wider, deeper perspective and a desire to steward our universal values in the earth for future generations, a part of wisdom. And then she just commented on just, wonderful comments, questions, and your book is wonderful.
Oh, I love those two comments.
Well, there's some more, and there's some questions, too.
Oh,
I wanted to integrate some of these things. Good. And Richard from Florida says, aging is a frightening process, especially living in an area where retirees abound. I said he's from Florida, from Sarasota. The limitations and physical challenges are so much more visible and impactful. So how do you approach the stigma of aging in a positive way?
I was so moved by those first two comments.
You can stay and comment on them if you want first. And then
yeah, Reb Zalman Schechter Shalomi, who was quoted there, founded Saging International, which provides this one-year training to become an elder. So he and Ram Dass really worked together to launch the conscious aging movement. And so thank you for mentioning him. So let's go back to stigma, because that's an important question, and I think it relates to the first comment. The first woman said she was looking for elders. She's looking for models, right? And then this third person said he's looking around and it's a lot of negative models. So there's a connection there. And I grew up with no positive model of an elder, no positive grandparent, and my father making lots of kind of critical, patronizing comments about older adults. And I think this is very common in our culture. Our housing is age segregated. So people don't grow up with positive grandparenting very much, or aunts and uncles. Some people do, but many, many people don't. And so we don't internalize that positive image. Just as we internalize our parents, we could internalize our grandparents, but if they're not around, or if they're not really positive, like mine were very negative images, then we don't get that. And so sometimes in our lives we can find mentors. And I think I've been extremely lucky that several mentors have shown up for me, and others I've sought out. And just kind of, made that happen for myself. And so I suggest that you do that. I suggest that, if there are people you respect, if they're whatever kind of world they're in, if there's a way for you to connect with them, that would really be great. Mentoring is so important. And then for the people now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, we are the mentors. We are the elders for the next generations, right? We are the ones blessing the youth now. And there are so many ways to do this. I just spent an afternoon with my 10-year-old grandson, and usually we're very active, playing tag and catch and all that. And we sat on the couch, and we were still. And I noticed that he was absorbing the calm of my body, because he's a very anxious kid. And he was absorbing the calm in my body. And I thought to myself, wow, I don't have to do anything. I can just be here. And he's actually receiving from me a message that it's okay to calm down, and also the message that I'm in my 70s and I'm thriving. I'm writing. I'm publishing. I'm teaching. And he's seeing that. And he's excited about the new book. So I'm modeling that for him, even though it wasn't modeled for me. And that's one of the ways to reduce the stigma in future generations and not pass down that intergenerational shadow to younger people. The other way to do that is do this inner work of age ourselves so that our own inner ageist is not activated when we see older people who might have physical limitations. We don't know who they are. You know, they could be in wheelchairs and be fantastic people. We don't know who they are. We don't know their gifts and their talents and their life stories. And if we only see a stereotype, then we're really not seeing who they are. We're in a projection. So those are some suggestions for working with the stigma.
Right. No, I think those are excellent suggestions. So Larry from Chippewa Falls says, or asks, do you have another word for work? He says, I found that many people think of work as hard, stressful, and yet we work in the garden, on our car, on our sewing project, etc. We use the same word, but in one case it can be enjoyable. Shifting my perspective of work has been helpful for me, but I'd like an alternative word. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's such a good question. You know, somebody else said to me, inner work, shadow work, spiritual work, right? Because that is the term that I used in the book, and I think it's a lack in our vocabulary. I think it's a missing piece. And I said in the book, this is not homework, because homework is so loaded, right, with obligation and performance. And I don't want the inner work of age to be like that. I don't want it to carry all that charge. So the only substitute I've come up with is practice, spiritual practice instead of spiritual work, emotional practice instead of emotional work. But inner work is a compound noun that does kind of express what I'm trying to say. And so that's a very perceptive comment, and I don't have a solution for it.
Great. Let's see. So Linda from Florida says, I just want to tell you how timely and important today's talk is for me personally and the way I'm living my life at age 84 and my hope to become larger and freer yet. All my thanks, Connie. And the same thanks to you, Dorian, for inviting Connie to be your speaker today. So
let me respond to that. One of the things that people have been asking me for is follow-ups to these interviews and workshops. And so what I'm suggesting is if people are interested, they can form a wisdom circle or a support group to do the inner work of age together, to go through the book and do the practices and support each other as they go through these transitions. So if that person, some of these comments kind of sound like people are wanting support or community for this time of life. And if that's the case, Dory, I don't know how you might do that because you have so many people on the call. Is there a way to what we would need is we would need somebody or more than one person to coordinate the logistics. And then after that, the groups of 8 or 10 could be leaderless. They'd just be on their own. I can come visit, but I'm not part of the group.
Great. A couple of other things, and then let's see. Larry said he appreciated your comment about the question regarding work. Mary from Sebastopol says, thank you for gently challenging me to go deeper in my own practice of aging. I love the questions you suggested. What is the gift that only I can give in the time that remains for me? And what will I regret not doing on my deathbed? Renee from New York said, that she has found that it's often helpful for people to write down in script, in handwriting, sort of things they're thinking about and doing, and that the writing, is such a helpful way. Let's see, she also says income is important for so many. Retirement's not possible, but it's possible to know that what you're doing is making a difference for others, as well as trying to find work that makes you feel good. I think that, and Barbara from New Jersey said it sounds like in the absence of the spiritual, we're looking for our purpose.
Good.
And Michelle from Boston says she's curious about traditional religions and the daily, weekly practice of going to church. COVID halted this in many ways, and she's finding more people are anxious and feeling very disconnected, and wondered if you had thoughts of how to reach out.
Yes, I think some church and synagogue communities have gone online, but it's been very disruptive. And so, yes, there's the loss of practice, but also the loss of community and connection to the clergy. I understand that. That's really been hard. In every traditional religion, there's a mystical stream that has the practices. And if you can find a practice that you can do on your own while your community is closed down, then it can connect you internally with your lineage and with your community. Do you know what I'm saying, Dory? So, like, for example, if you belong to a synagogue but you can't go, there are Jewish mystical practices that you can do. And the same with different Christian denominations, and you can't go to your church or be with your clergy person. There are internal practices that you can do during this time that will help you to feel connected. So that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion. I think reaching out also just by phone to either a rabbi or a priest, because I think that, there are many things around that people don't always know about, both spiritual practices as well as just, ways of feeling less isolated, intergenerational connections. There's a lot of things that I'm aware of are happening in many faith-based organizations, so I would encourage that. It's time to kind of pull together. This has just been wonderful, but I wonder if you have any other final thoughts, takeaways, that you'd like to mention. I mean, first of all, how can people get in touch with you or learn about you? You want to mention your website?
Well, the book is available wherever you buy books.
Right.
My online events are being posted on my website, conniezweig.com. CONNIEZWEIG.com. And, feel free to join me at any of the workshops if you're interested in that. Also, if you form a wisdom circle, I will come and visit and, help facilitate if I can. I think I'd like to close by saying that we can use the conditions of our age, like the woman who commented saying to expand and open further in her 80s. We can use the conditions of our age to expand our development along with our expanded longevity. And I like to say age is our curriculum. Mm-hmm. And whether that's about retirement or illness or giving and receiving forgiveness, reconciling relationships, or our spiritual lives, if we've been, spiritually disillusioned, or whether it's about the desire to transition from senior to elder, or whether it's about service. There's a large chapter on engaging to serve the common good as an elder. All of these opportunities come with this stage of life, and there's very little guidance for this in our culture. Thankfully, there's a lot of podcasting now, like Dory's, which is just so fabulous, and some communities like Saging and Elders Action Network that are really bringing people together. But in general, there's not a lot of guidance to do deep inner work at this time. And so I hope you'll join me on this journey. It's just been life-changing for me. And feel free to get in touch with me if you want to connect.
And Connie, thank you so much for taking this time, your time. And I do want to recommend, as I said at the beginning, in case some of you came on late, it's a wonderful book. And there's just such wisdom and perspective in it. So I really encourage you to get yourself a copy. And you can listen. I both have a copy, and I listen to it because I just find that I love being read to also. And so if you're not a good reader, get the Audible version. So thanks again, and thank you everybody for being here today. And Connie, thanks so much for being here and sharing your wisdom. And there have been some other comments about just thanking you so much, that presenting Susan from Victoria says, much gratitude for presenting this exquisitely important work. So thank you.
I have tears in my eyes, Dory. I'm so grateful to you. Really, really grateful to you.
Great. All right. Well, take care, and everybody stay well and safe. Take care. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio with Dr. Dorian Mintzer. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show, listen to past episodes, or download our free retirement transition guide, visit revolutionizeyourretirementradio.com.